Canada hits back at Trump, and his next move could make the trade war much worse. Trump wanted Canada to fall in line. Canada just did the opposite. Canada has answered Donald Trump's latest tariff offensive with one of its clearest acts of economic retaliation yet, imposing new duties on $27.6 billion Canadian dollars of American imports and matching Washington dollar for dollar and rate for rate. The measures will take effect on September 8th and cover more than 700 products at tariff rates of 15%, 25%, and 50%. The immediate question is therefore no longer whether Canada will retaliate. It has. The more dangerous question is what Trump does when a government he has spent months pressuring refuses to concede and instead sends the economic pain straight back across the border. Canada has chosen retaliation instead of submission. Ottawa's counterattack is deliberately broad. Steel, dairy products, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics are among the sectors covered, with Canadian officials saying the measures are designed to mirror the American tariffs rather than simply generate revenue. Canada is also putting money behind the confrontation. The government has announced $7.5 billion Canadian dollars in new and expanded support for businesses and workers affected by the dispute, on top of almost $25 billion Canadian dollars in previously announced assistance. That matters because Canada is signaling something larger than anger. It is preparing to absorb economic damage rather than accept the terms Washington put on the table. Canadian officials say the United States proposed conditions that were not in Canada's national interest, and that Ottawa suspended negotiations, rather than accept a deal it believed would damage strategic industries and Canadian sovereignty. That creates precisely the sort of confrontation Trump has repeatedly tried to resolve through greater leverage. Why Trump is unlikely to ignore the challenge. There has not yet been a confirmed fresh Trump response specifically to Canada's final retaliatory tariff announcement at the time of publication, but his behavior immediately before it gives a strong indication of what may come next. Trump has already threatened to raise tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, and automotive parts to 50% from January. That threat came as the broader dispute intensified following the collapse of negotiations. He has also publicly told Canadian leaders to fall in line, while his rhetoric towards Ottawa has become increasingly confrontational. The most likely immediate response is therefore not retreat. It is escalation in language first. Trump can portray Canada's counter-tariffs as proof that Ottawa is refusing to give American exporters fair treatment. Use the retaliation to justify the aggressive position he has already taken and threaten additional consequences, unless Canada returns to negotiations on terms more acceptable to Washington. What cannot yet be said is that he will definitely impose another tariff package. The distinction matters. Threatening escalation costs Trump very little. Actually implementing another huge round of tariffs risks creating new economic problems inside the United States. The auto industry is the obvious next pressure point. If Trump decides that Canada's retaliation requires another material response, automobiles are the most obvious weapon. The president has already placed that threat on the table. Cars and automotive parts are unusually powerful leverage because the Canadian and American industries are deeply integrated. Components can cross the border several times before a finished vehicle reaches a customer, meaning a severe tariff does not remain neatly confined to one country. It can spread through factories, suppliers, transport networks, dealers, and eventually consumer prices. That gives Trump leverage over Canada. It also gives Canada leverage over the United States. The more aggressively Washington disrupts the North American automotive system, the harder it becomes to ensure that the economic damage falls only on Canadian workers. American factories and suppliers connected to the same production chains can also be exposed. That is the central contradiction now sitting inside Trump's strategy. The United States is unquestionably the larger economy and possesses far greater capacity to hurt Canada. Yet precisely because the two economies are so tightly connected, maximum economic pressure on Canada cannot be guaranteed to remain on the Canadian side of the border. Trump still has reasons not to escalate immediately. There is another possibility. Trump could respond furiously in public, while delaying the next concrete economic move. That would allow Washington to keep the threat of 50% automotive tariffs hanging over Canada, while giving negotiators another opportunity to reach an agreement before those measures become reality. There is precedent for that approach. On August 18th, Trump temporarily suspended additional duties affecting Canadian alcohol, dairy products, and motor vehicles for 3 days, after administration officials said negotiations had progressed enough to justify additional time. The suspension ultimately expired and the wider confrontation resumed, but it demonstrated that Trump is prepared to use tariff deadlines as negotiating pressure, rather than treating every announced measure as irreversible. That means Trump's response does not have to fit neatly into either back down or escalate. He can do both politics and negotiation simultaneously. Attack Canada publicly, announce or repeat a severe future tariff threat, and still leave enough time for Ottawa to make concessions before it activates. The political risk is moving south. Canada has also chosen targets that can create American political pressure. Tariffs on products such as steel, food, appliances, electronics, clothing, and other consumer or industrial goods do not exist in an economic vacuum. Importers must either absorb the additional cost, negotiate lower prices from suppliers, switch suppliers, or pass at least part of the cost onwards. The United States is approaching the November midterm elections. That makes the domestic distribution of trade war pain increasingly important. A tariff confrontation that appears politically strong in Washington becomes more complicated when companies, farmers, manufacturers, or consumers in strategically important states begin attributing higher costs or disrupted markets to the dispute. That does not mean political pressure will force Trump to retreat. It does mean his incentive is to convince voters that Canada, rather than his own tariff policy, is responsible for any economic consequences. Expect that argument to become central if the confrontation intensifies. Canada has created a test Trump cannot easily ignore. The real significance of today's announcement is psychological as much as financial. Trump has repeatedly used tariffs as a negotiating weapon because the threat is most effective when the other government believes resisting will become more painful than agreeing. Canada has now publicly chosen resistance. It has matched Washington's new tariffs, established an implementation date, and committed billions of dollars to protecting exposed Canadian industries. If Trump simply absorbs that response without increasing pressure, Ottawa can argue that retaliation works. If he escalates immediately, however, he risks pushing two of the world's most deeply connected economies further into a trade conflict in which American businesses and consumers cannot be completely insulated. That is why the next move matters far beyond 27.6 billion Canadian dollars of trade. What Trump is most likely to do next? The highest probability scenario is a combination of threats and negotiation. Trump is likely to attack Canada's decision publicly, blame Mark Carney's government for the deterioration in relations, and repeat or strengthen the warning that Canadian automotive exports could face substantially higher tariffs if Ottawa refuses to change course. A smaller but significant possibility is that Washington identifies another Canadian sector for punishment or accelerates an existing tariff timetable. The least likely immediate outcome is an unconditional American retreat. Trump has invested too much political capital in presenting tariffs as leverage against countries he believes treat the United States unfairly. Canada's decision to retaliate makes backing away without extracting something from Ottawa harder politically. Yet September 8th gives both governments something valuable: time. Canada's counter-tariffs do not take effect immediately. That leaves a narrow window in which the threat of retaliation exists without the full cost yet being imposed. Trump can use that window. So can Carney. The coming confrontation will therefore turn on whether Trump believes Canada can still be forced into a better deal through another threat, or whether Ottawa has decided the price of resistance is now lower than the price of submission. If neither side changes that calculation before September 8th, North America's tariff dispute will stop being primarily a negotiating tactic. It will become an increasingly expensive test of which government is prepared to absorb more pain.